Professor Tucker, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to discuss the midterm election with us.
My pleasure.
So, what happened in this election? So we know the results, what happened in the Senate, what happened in the House, but from your perspective, what are the takeaway points from this election? What's going on?
Right. So I think there are two kind of key takeaway points from this. One is that the sort of hardening of the United States into sort of two camps is getting stronger, right? So one of the things we've been was just discussed here at this conference is that we're now seeing that even weak candidates will get a larger percentage of the vote because people's votes are really being driven by whether they see themselves as a Democrat or they see themselves as a Republican, and we continue to see a kind of growing bifurcation in this regard. But at the same time, we're seeing what's called the sort of nationalization of U.S. politics, whereby we're seeing greater and greater congruence between who people are voting for, say, in the presidential election and who they're voting for in the congressional elections. In a weird way, it's becoming slightly more like Italy
Or
and
Europe.
becoming slightly more of a parliamentary system, although, of course, in the United States, the governing party just lost the lower house of government, which in a parliamentary system would mean they would be out of
problem.
power. But we do have this odd thing about the United States where we have these off-cycle elections where the governing party can lose control of the lower house and then still stay in power, right? Which doesn't happen, obviously, in a parliamentary system.
Absolutely.
That's sort of the first big story about this, right? The second story is that we did see a strong swing back towards the Democratic Party. But again, in this kind of calcification type picture, it was primarily in suburban areas. So Democrats have been very popular within the cities, Republicans very popular in the rural areas. What we saw today was areas that were kind of in between those two that had historically been more Republican. There was a shift to Democrats. And in particular, there was a shift to Democrats among college-educated women. And in particular, even among college-educated white women, which had broken for college-educated white women had broken for Trump, I believe, in the 2016 election, but we're seeing large gender gaps opening up. Now, we had already had African American women being perhaps the strongest bulwark of the Democratic Party at this point. Republicans have gotten increasingly unpopular with Asian Americans, Latin America, Latinx. But this sort of white America is where Trump and the Republican Party still gets its base of support for here. So losing this significant chunk of college-educated whites, but in particular college-educated white women, was a big change. A third big thing to take out of this election is that we now live in a situation in the United States, and this is going to be a little hard to sort of get from a kind of any country that uses a proportional system, but we live in a situation where for the Democrats to win control of the House of Representatives, they need to win the popular vote by something like 5%. At least, and they did win the popular vote by that much. But think about that: if the Republicans had lost the popular vote by 3%, they would have still controlled the House of Representatives. From a European perspective, this is kind of an anathema. How can you? I mean, we sometimes in parliamentary systems get weird situations where the leading party, no one will form a coalition with it. But here we're talking about a party that could have gotten the majority of the votes, right, and not gotten control of the government. And this is a potential very big long-term problem for the United States. We have seen now in 2 of the last 5 presidential elections, the party that won the presidential vote, right, the popular vote and the presidential vote, lost the presidency. So the Democrats have won the popular vote in 4 out of the last 5 presidential elections, but they've only won the presidency in 2 of those 5 elections. Now we have this very stark picture in the House of Representatives where the Democrats need to win at least 5% more of the vote, right? Republicans can win the House getting 2% more, 2% less, 3% less of the popular vote. We're also seeing this hardening. So we talked about a sort of political polarization hardening, but the polarization of the United States has a geographic basis, right? So we are seeing part of the reason why Democrats need to win by a lot is that the Democratic Party is so popular in cities that, like in my district where NYU is in New York, in Greenwich Village, the Democratic candidate wins like 90% to 10%. Right? Those are wasted votes in a sense, and we don't have a compensatory mechanism along the lines of the German system or the Hungarian system. We don't have a way where those wasted votes go to count towards the distribution of seats. And so the more that you have liberals moving to urban areas, the more you're going to have these wasted votes, and so this is a sort of long-term problem. There's a geographic sorting problem that leads to the Republicans being able to win more seats in a 60-40 or a 55-45, and Democrats winning more seats 90-10 or 80-20. There's also this concept that we have in the United States called gerrymandering, where political parties, again, which sounds a little insane for people coming from Europe, but political parties in many states get to draw the districts. And so they draw the districts in particular ways where you have a situation like in North Carolina where you have 50% of the population voting for Democrats, 50% voting for Republicans, and then the Democrats get 3 seats and the Republicans I think get 13 or 12. I don't remember exactly what the number is. We had this in Pennsylvania as well, but Pennsylvania got redistricted. The courts ruled this gerrymander was illegal, and it went from a situation where I believe it was that the Republicans, despite again about 50-50 in here, it was that the Republicans had, I think it was 12 seats and the Democrats had 6 seats. After the redistricting, 9 seats to 9 seats, a much more proportional looking system. There's a final sort of longer term problem along this line of disproportionality, which has to do with the US Senate. In the United States, every state gets set 2 senators, regardless of the size. And the purpose was an original deal, back when the country was founded, to sort of balance popular vote, which would favor the larger states that were coming together to form this union, and representing a federation that represented the individual member states, where each member state, kind of like Luxembourg getting, an equal vote to Germany and the European Union, and that sort of things. So one of the bigger problems is that we used to have more of a history of the states would elect senators from different parties, or that the spread across states was different and it varied by different periods of time. Now, with this, again, this calcification of U.S. politics around heavily partisan lines, you're seeing a situation where these Senate seats may become permanently for one party or another. And again, you have this problem with your big urban areas. So California, which has 52 million people, those 2 senators are going to be Democrat for the foreseeable future. New York is going to have 2 Democratic senators for the foreseeable future with its, I forget how many people we have in New York, 18 million people or something like that. But then you have all these smaller rural states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, right, which have much, much lower populations that also get 2 senators. And while historically, if you have different parties can win the Senate seats in different states, then okay, it's not fair that as a New Yorker my vote counts
less.
1/20th of what someone's vote counts in Wyoming, but it didn't necessarily have a huge impact on the sort of political perception. Yeah. And I've started to see figures that in 20 years from now we're going to have 30% of the population in the United States electing 50% of the senators. So I think there are some really big questions now, and you combine that with the fact that Trump as president has sort of blown through norms of how that have constrained the behavior of politicians from taking actions that may have been legal but were not done, right? And in particular, this predates Trump when the Republicans denied a vote on a Supreme Court justice that was nominated by Obama and just said, we're not going to vote on him until after the election. So you might begin to see things that say, okay, if the Republicans are not going to play fair and there are these structural factors that favor Republicans and Democrats are disadvantaged, they're literally disadvantaged by the system, needing to win more votes to get majorities, you might see people begin to start talking about differences. So one thing that I think it was the New York Times or the Washington Post, one of the 2 just had an editorial where they were saying we should increase the size of the House of Representatives, which hasn't happened in 100 years in the United States. Or you might see, if a Democratic president comes back to office, appointing more Supreme Court justices. There's nothing that says the Supreme Court is fixed at 9. You might see the Democrats say, okay, well, we're going to appoint more. Or you might see moves to adding states to the union, where Puerto Rico or D.C. would become states to try to balance off some of these structural advantages Republicans have.
I've also heard the possible creation of 2 Californias, Northern California and Southern California, to increase to 4 the number of senators. But I mean, this is something very interesting. We actually did an analysis before the election. We had the 18 red states, 18 blue states and 19 red states.
Right.
And basically the population was 5 million on average for the red states and 7.5 million for the blue states.
Right.
So basically a 50% discount rate on how many votes you need to have.
And in some ways it goes both ways. We don't have time right now to get into the Electoral College. I actually gave a lecture here on this at Villa Pietra many years ago. But this could work against the Republicans too, insofar as if Texas, which got that's another thing that was a big deal in this election. The Texas Senate race was much, much closer than a national election. If Texas became a blue state, a Democratic state, and the Democrats went into a presidential election controlling California, Texas, and New York, it begins to get increasingly hard to imagine how a Republican could ever get elected president. So there are there's some very odd sort of structural factors of the way the U.S. is set up. In some ways, it's a very proportional system in the sense that, the parties each get about 50% of the vote, and they both get about 50% of the seats. On the other ways, it seems incredibly unfair. The Democrats need to win by 5. They need to get 5% more of the popular vote. The Republicans don't. But compared to things we've seen like in Poland and Russia, where parties can get a third of the vote and get 2/3 of the seats because you have so many small parties that don't make it into the parliament, it feels kind of proportional. But at the end of the day, it's a single member. It's a single member district system. It's a two-party system, and there are some very odd quirks about how these districts are drawn, about the Senate, the way the Senate seats are assigned, and how much power the Senate has. There are other countries that have upper houses that represent regions, but there's usually those upper houses are much weaker. And then finally, the Electoral College.